U.S. lawmakers back on Capitol Hill after narrowly averting a government shutdown. But the bipartisan deal could cost House Speaker Kevin McCarthy his job. That measure does not include funding for Ukraine. White House correspondent Nathan King has more from Capitol Hill.
So shutdown averted, Congress is open, museums are open, military are getting paid as well as other workers. So everything's fine again in Washington, D.C., right? Wrong. Essentially what they did was pass a stopgap measure, which the middle of November, 45 days, essentially means we're back in the same place. Also, Kevin McCarthy had to rely on Democratic votes to get this continuing resolution passed through the House. He also had to strip the bill of any Ukraine funding, and essentially the rebels got their way in terms of disrupting the proceedings, knowing he couldn't go on with Republican votes. And one of them now, Matt Gaetz, is essentially saying, we're going to vote this week to get you out of the speakership because you did some sort of side deal potentially with the White House and the Senate about restoring Ukraine funding in a separate way. Let's have a listen.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask that these questions be answered soon, because there may be other votes coming today or later this week that could be implicated by the answers to these questions. Members of the Republican Party might vote differently on a motion to vacate if they heard what the Speaker had to share with us about his secret side deal with Joe Biden on Ukraine. I'll be listening.
Now, the Ukraine funding is really central to this. Remember, there was like $24 billion asked by the administration in this round of appropriations, they call it. That got cut down to $6 billion, then left out entirely. Now, the White House has indicated they're not going to let Ukraine down, that they are going to come up with money, that there seems to be some verbal, if not written, agreement between the House Speaker here, Kevin McCarthy, the White House and the Senate to introduce it at some point. But it's not as easy as that ever in Washington. House Republicans are saying, and not just the rebels, if we're going to pass Ukraine funding, it's got to be tied to some giveaway from the Democrats, like more protection at the southern border, which is a big electoral issue for them to stop illegal immigration. So it could be delayed by a while. And remember, we are back here in 45 days. Nothing has been agreed to, no spending bills going through. The rebels still think they have a chance to push their agenda because the majority of the Republicans in the House is so slim, about 4 or 5 votes. Meanwhile, the fact that Kevin McCarthy may lose his job or his job be threatened means this could also have a huge problem going forward. But could the Republicans have to choose a new speaker within 45 days, or is he so beholden to the rebels for his job that he'll have to give more ground? Washington is a mess. I know that's not news, but it continues to be a story. Nathan King, CGTN, outside the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, and there are so many moving parts to this stopgap measure that has given government its pause, and we're going to talk more about that for these next 45 days. And we're joined by Spencer Critchley, a two-time Obama campaign advisor and author of Patriots of Two Nations. Spencer, thanks very much for coming. In the spirit of full disclosure, I spent all weekend on Capitol Hill covering this thing, so I had a very up close and personal look at this. Look, I want to give an international audience, try to make sense of this for people. October 1st is the start of the new fiscal year, and the U.S. needs to have money in its coffers to continue funding things. Now, it used to be very rare that something like this would happen, and it seems like every September 30th we do this dance, beginning with Clinton in '95 and then Obama in 2014 over Affordable Care Act, and then of course Trump in 2018 over the wall. But this one was really punishing, and some people called it the stopgap against nothing. Try to explain to people what happened and how close this came to failing. And really, it's not just the U.S. government that's at stake. I mean, it could really have a dramatic effect on the global economy.
Yes, it certainly could. The credibility of the United States in terms of meeting its obligations is a foundation of the global economy. So we're not just playing with people's lives in the United States. Doing this sort of thing is playing with people's lives around the world. And the people running that game are people who will be insulated from whatever terrible damage results from it. In the past, these threats of government shutdowns have not been taken particularly seriously by Washington insiders because they could reliably predict that in the last day or two at the latest, some kind of deal would be reached, because all of the participants, even if some of them might be acting in bad faith, were at least basically rational, basically sane, or at least basically thought the United States government should keep functioning and we shouldn't deal very serious blows to the United States, let alone the rest of the world. That, unfortunately, is no longer the case. The level of irresponsibility in the Republican Party has been growing, actually, for a long time. I would trace it to the early 90s with Newt Gingrich, but at an accelerating pace since Donald Trump was people like Matt Gaetz and what's often called the clown caucus or the crazy caucus or the chaos caucus, who are strictly performative. They're completely unserious people. They just want to be seen to be engaged in a fight, and they want to raise money off of that fight, and that seems to be about as far as their political thinking goes.
Yeah, I think that was a pretty good synopsis of everything. Now, lawmakers have agreed to this temporary deal. Nathan just talked about they have a little more than 6 weeks to approve a budget moving forward. Let's talk about some of the details that were hammered out at the 11th hour. To me, it was fascinating to see Speaker McCarthy cross party lines, someone who had made his line in the sand for weeks on end saying he would never do this. Now, we heard he took the billions out for future Ukrainian aid. There is money in there for funding of disaster relief measures for all the damage caused by climate change this year. But the Republicans didn't get their money for the border funding as well. Talk about this and how significant all this is.
Well, this is part of the insanity of what they're doing, and another indication of their total lack of seriousness. The people threatening to shut down the government that included shutting down border security, which is supposedly one of their absolute top priorities. But of course, they're not serious about deficit reduction here. Again, it's pure performance. If you look at just a simple pie chart of the federal budget, you'll see that what they're attacking amounts to maybe 11 or 12% of the part of the federal budget that could be addressed this way, and it makes barely a dent in overall deficit. And of course, they increased the deficit and debt by unprecedented, just breathtaking amounts just a few years ago under President Trump.
Absolutely.
So I think that in terms of going forward, we're not going to see any seriousness from these people. And from Kevin McCarthy, unfortunately, I'd say we're not going to see any glimmers of character. He has to be one of the weakest speakers in the history of the House. And by comparison with Nancy Pelosi, for example, I mean, the comparison could hardly be more stark. It's hard to imagine Nancy Pelosi tolerating this kind of behavior for a moment, which, you know, as a sidelight, casts an interesting light on the Republican hysteria about the supposed crisis of masculinity. I think we see that crisis of traditional masculinity, at least in Speaker McCarthy and many other Republicans in the past few years.
Let's talk a little bit what happened. Is this a temporary fix? Obviously it is. In terms of McCarthy keeping his job, is this someone leading Republicans in the Congress? What's it going to do to fundraising for him? How can he say he goes out there and champions conservative causes when Democrats really bail him out? And what do you think his chances of losing his job in the next 6 weeks are?
That's kind of anyone's guess, I think. I mean, I suspect that the Democrats will actually end up saving him, depending on whether they can come to a deal with him, you know, during which negotiations I think they should certainly insist on getting some of their needs met, such as continuing to fund Ukraine's defense against the Russian invasion, for example.
Right.
So I suspect that it'll end up being Democrats bailing him out. Of course, that'll just weaken him further. You know, he doesn't work as a principled moderate. He could certainly have followed that route, and I think that would have been a smart way to go. People often underestimate the value of just having some integrity.
Yeah.
It turns out people actually really do like that.
I don't mean to laugh, but it really is bad.
You know, it's funny. People don't believe that honesty and integrity are actually a really smart way to go. It's just nobody seems to believe it.
You really would like to think it counts for something, right?
Yeah. No. So he's damaged himself as a principled moderate, and he's damaged himself as a right-wing extremist. which, by the way, has nothing to do with traditional conservatism. So I don't see this working either way.
I hate to push you on this, but we don't have a lot of time left. How important is it to get this done within the next 45 days? And do you see this agony going on, peeling the Band-Aid off one little bit at a time?
Well, I certainly hope we get it done in the next 45 days. I mean, even if we don't shut down the government or under other circumstances where there have been threats to default on the debt, even if we don't do something as serious as that, it's very damaging just to have these rolling, provisional continuing resolutions. That in itself damages U.S. credibility.